Good evening, everybody. How are you? So how many people are here for credit? Who was told by their teacher to be here? Go ahead, don't be shy. Raise your hands. Good. So I'm going to be talking to you tonight as much as I am to everybody else in this room because a great friend of mine who's an economist likes to waggle his finger at me, who's older than me, and say, you're done. You're finished. The people that are going to truly answer this question are that next generation. So my hope is that tonight we can talk about the intersection between those two generations, some of the things that we've seen in the context of best practice and also looking ahead to what the future capacity really could or should be. So to expand on the introduction, my office is a brand new office for the state of Colorado. There are only 3 states in the country right now that have an office of outdoor recreation industry. Utah, they were the first, believe it or not. They've had the position for about 2 years, and their position was a little bit more reactionary in relation to the land transfer conversation that was happening at the state level, the transfer of public lands to state level control. So Governor Herbert at that point said, you know, we should probably take care of this multi-billion-dollar economic engine that's within our state, so let's appoint someone to help oversee that industry. And his name was Brad Peterson, and so I have to give credit where credit is due. Brad was the first of us and really pointed the way in the context of what those relationships could or should look like. The phrase we used all the time was silo busting. You have motorized, you have mountain biking, you have hunting and fishing, you have paddling, you have hiking, you have climbing. How do those sports intersect with wildlife corridors? How do those wildlife corridors intersect with oil and gas, population increases? So all of those questions, he kind of pointed the way, and about 7 months ago, Governor Hickenlooper started asking the same questions about Colorado and said, well, if Utah can do it, we sure should be able to do it too. And so a small group was formed to start asking those questions that if we did it here, what would it really look like? What could or should this rule be? And so I brought up the silo busting comment, and then I also brought up the fact that we're in a much different place here. There's a reason why the room is packed tonight. It's packed because we care. And it's a lot less reactionary and a lot more proactive to what's possible. So that's the good news. So this role's been around for about 6.5, 7 months. And Utah, then Colorado, and Washington State just approved legislation for this office as well. So they'll be the third. We're thinking Oregon will be the fourth, and probably New Hampshire will be the first state on the East Coast. Now, why? Why does it matter? You know, when you start to think about the definition of who we are and what we are as Coloradans and as it relates to open space, I want to share a couple of things with you. Now, the picture on the left, you know, it's that iconic classic 14er picture that you see every Saturday morning at sunset or sunrise, depending on the 14er. Lots of people going out and enjoying certain sectors of our trail systems as well as our peaks that really not only drive our recreation patterns, but also drive tourism patterns as well. There's a reason why people move here. There's a reason why people vacation here. They want a little piece of what we have. And what we have, and I'll use the picture in the bottom right as an example. Those are two of my good buddies that are part of a bluegrass band up in Eagle. It's a little weird, and it's a little off-center, but it's a whole lot of fun. And a lot of people want a piece of what we have. Now, you might think the kids up in the right corner have nothing to do with trail systems, but I'm going to tie that to my request in the beginning for the students in the room to raise their hands. I showed up at a park in Denver where their summer camp was being held. It was just a day camp where kids would get dropped off, do different activities, and then go back home. And I saw this circle of kids with PFDs on and paddles in front of them, and they were talking about paddler safety. And my mindset, my generational mindset, started looking around on the lake, trying to find the old aluminum Grumman canoes that these kids were going to get into, because surely that's what they were doing. And this little kid with his hat put on backwards, looking at the camera, came up to me and said, we're not in canoes, we're on stand-up paddleboards, because my dad has a stand-up paddleboard, and so does my mom, and I'm going to learn how to stand-up paddleboard, because that's what I'm going to do. So there's a shift. There's a shift in sport, and there's also a shift in culture about how we're defining what's possible and also what's important. So I share this with you as an example of a much larger question. Is anybody here familiar with the Summertime Operations Bill for the ski industry here in Colorado? Okay, I'll give you a little bit of background on this. Did anybody know that before about a year and a half ago, snowboarding on any mountain in Colorado was pretty much illegal? Anybody know that? You want to know why? Because it wasn't a part of the terms of the lease that ski mountains had with the Forest Service. Because snowboarding didn't exist when those leases were written. So Vail Resorts, being a larger company here in Colorado, started the political process of saying, well, A, we should probably make a large majority of the sport on our mountains legal, and B, if we can't do anything else with this mountain or in this process, how can we really not only utilize this resource as a community, but how can we also show that it's a gateway to a national forest? More people touch national forests in our state through our ski mountains than any place else. It's kind of an interesting statistic. And now with the passage of the Summertime Operations Bill and with the same environmental impact study that any other process in any other forest would have to go through, you're seeing ropes courses on top of Vail Mountain. You're seeing canopy tours that would rival any high-angle canopy tour in Costa Rica on Breckenridge. So these definitions of what sports are and what the intersections are changing, and they're changing incredibly rapidly. So here's some statistics. There was a great quote about the $4.2 billion in wages and salaries that are generated here in Colorado. But the outdoor industry in Colorado, and these numbers come from the SCORP report, the Outdoor Recreation Plan report from Colorado Parks and Wildlife, $34.5 billion in consumer spending, with a B. This isn't us just talking about nickels and dimes and saying, we don't know where funding goes, we don't know how it's created, how are we going to take care of all of this? It's a serious economic engine for the state. Over 350,000 Colorado jobs and a lot in state and local tax revenue. So when you start to look at it through that lens, how do we do what we do here? This is actually in Boulder. I don't think he's actually here tonight. I wish he was, because I'd love to call him out. He's one of the most innovative people I know. This is who we are as Coloradans. This is that sort of half wacky, half innovative, and a whole lot inspired spirit that drives how we interact with not only public lands, but outdoor recreation as a whole, as a community. When I saw this thing, he put it really simply. He's like, I'm tired of the doinky little basket that I've got in front of my bike, and the panniers don't fit everything I need, so I got myself a shopping cart, and this is what I did. Now, right? And some people are like, looks like a really good idea. But deepen that process a little bit, because we are part of a multi-billion-dollar economic engine, and you show up with things like this. The latest and greatest, the Fat Tire mountain bike that's now used for trail service work. Notice the combination of chainsaw and beer with a glove bag right in the middle of the seat, right? So it's those innovations. We don't only dream it up, we also have enough of an economic engine behind us to fund these solutions, to figure out how to take things forward. Now, there are some people in this room that are saying to themselves, I have to pick up a rake before I go camping this summer. Because if I invite 5 friends, this is how we have to do it. You know, when you start to define what crazy really is, or what genius really is, that blend and that understanding only comes with a balance of perspective and time. So the ideas that are outlandish that sometimes we propose in the context of taking care of public lands seem crazy, because they go against the grain. They go against the norm of everything we've done up to this point. A good friend of mine refers to public lands in this way. He says, you know, as Americans, as a nation, we've gotten a whole lot of something for a whole lot of nothing for a really long time. And the thing that's supported that process up to this point has been the volunteerism and the spirit of stewardship that we all try to foster in our communities. But how are we going to do that for the next generation? What's that going to look like if we don't ask some of those crazy questions? I was talking in the back of the room before we got started about a concept that's been talked about for a long time under the umbrella of public lands and how we take care of these lands. Pay to play. I hear it all the time in this new role. How are we going to take care of the lands that we have when the price tag for maintenance of these trails and these lands keeps growing and growing? Now here in Boulder, over $2 million has been allocated to take care of some of these processes, and that's fantastic. But my question is always, what happens after that $2 million is gone? You look at Colorado 14ers Initiative. It's an organization, it's a nonprofit that monitors trails and trail impact on all the 14ers in Colorado. And every year they do a thing called a 14ers report card. Anybody seen this in this room? Know what that is? So they surveyed 16 peaks this year. And Lloyd, their executive director, says over $24 million will currently be needed to repair existing damage on those 16 14ers. And again, the question remains, if that $24 million rained from the sky tomorrow, what happens when that's gone? What are the mechanisms that we're building now to take care of it in 50 years? So when you think about pay to play in that regard, it doesn't seem so crazy. Now layer on this intersection of technology and what's going on out there. And I'll share a funny story with you. It has to do with the metal rangers, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. You all know the tube and the little envelope that has the little write down for your license plate. You put the little sticky in your window. You never have $6, so you put $10 in the envelope, feeling really good about your donation. You lick it and you stick it in the little slot in the metal ranger, right, in the tube. That's how you pay sometimes for trail access, parking access, and we call them the metal rangers. I was having this conversation with a friend from Google, and all of you know that Google's here and coming even larger to Boulder over the next couple of years. And he said, you know, Luis, first of all, that's an archaic process, and B, imagine the same kind of pole but with a solar panel on top of it and a Wi-Fi antenna. And when you walked up to the trailhead, you could take out something that certainly isn't going to go away anytime soon, that will continue to evolve and develop, and with one swipe, you put your funds towards a good cause, the trail you're going to hike. And not only that, but maybe you get to see a listing of all volunteer days that are on that trail, so you could actually sign up to take care of the trail that you're walking on. Maybe you see a listing of all the nonprofits that operate in the area that focus on conservation and stewardship. So there are all these intersections of things that in the beginning might seem a little crazy, but long term might just be the solution that we're looking for. Obviously, it's progression. I don't know if any of you have ever played in any of the parks, the terrain parks on any of our ski mountains across the state, but I don't know if anybody in this room, and raise your hand if you do, because you should be proud of this, would feel comfortable walking up to something like this and saying, I got it, and put their skis on and take off. Anybody? Anybody feel? I like that. That's good. Bold. Well done. So A, you should be proud of that, and B, we need to learn from how he figured that progression out. Because that's the boldness and that's the ingenuity that we're going to have to figure out. We're going to have to look at problems that size, and instead of going, oh, it's going to take years to do the mini ramp, there's no way I'm going to be able to get there without, maybe if ever, we're going to have to find the people that are bold enough to do that and figure out what they did to get there and accelerate that process. Now here's why. Now, I don't know about the rest of you, but when I used to think about mountain biking with a hardtail and suspension in the front, I thought of a nice dirt-covered trail in the woods that, you know, wasn't all that crazy, and it was really a chance to have a relationship, not only with that trail, but with the wildlife corridor and with the nature that surrounded it. These days, when you define mountain biking, there are some horrific terrain trails out there that are really, really fun, but again, changing the definition of how things are done. And those paths don't appear magically. I can't say enough, especially to the people in this room, the effort that's required to make some of these things happen. So let's focus on these facts and these intersections that we're talking about, because ultimately, I'm hopeful that this is the context of our conversation tonight. By 2040, we're going to top 7.1 million people in Colorado. Now, most folks, that would scare you. The option to that would be to consider this an opportunity. If you really look at it under the construct of, if we truly are a multi-billion-dollar industry and community, and we really do have that voice and that power, and people are moving here because of what we have, and what we stand for, and why we're here, What an incredible opportunity to educate even more folks about what's possible and how we're going to do it. Now, the I-70 corridor in and around the Grand Valley, the highest growth rates, and studies have shown, and this is again coming out of Colorado Parks and Wildlife, the biggest ground zero for this growth, you guessed it, is going to be right here. Now, obviously, growth in urban areas are going to have all kinds of challenges on their own with managing wildlife corridors and outdoor recreation resources, but again, it's that conversation with the new users. It's that kid that doesn't want to get in an aluminum canoe, that wants to get on a stand-up paddleboard instead. How are we going to educate him about river corridors? Because it's the same river, it's the same issues, it's just a different vehicle to enjoy that resource. Here's an interesting statistic. Anybody in here know this? Over 80% of folks that live here participate in trail-related activities. And more than 57% have gotten on the water. Now, take that 80% and add that population increase, and you can see some of the challenges and some of the conversations we're going to have. So the 4 tenets that my office is really trying to focus on at this point are the 4 that you see on the screen. And I want to kind of explain in closing somewhat of the intersection between all of these. So economic development, again, if we're going to keep this voice strong in the state, understanding what this resource is and what it could or should be, we have to understand what the organizations that move here under the umbrella of outdoor recreation stand for. Philosophically, community engagement-wise, we have to understand if they're willing to be a part of the solution instead of being part of the problem. That's going to need to be a component of how we recruit organizations to the state. Conservation and stewardship, that's the obvious one. But again, I go back to some of these crazy or genius questions. Do we need to look differently at the funding streams for how we take care of these resources? And not only rely on the spirit of volunteerism, but also rely on the fact that if we come up with a solvent, robust way to fund some of our efforts and take care of these resources, we can enjoy them long into the future. A friend of mine put it this way. Imagine living in your neighborhood and you need to put a new roof on your house. And instead of going out and hiring a contractor, you decide there's got to be a different way to do it. So I'm going to buy the materials, but I'm going to go around to all my neighbors, knock on their doors, and I'm going to get them to dedicate every weekend to putting my roof on my house. Now, if you're an upstanding member of your neighborhood and your neighbors actually like you, they might actually agree to help you a little bit. It's sort of that barn-raising mentality. You might get away with it with the first roof. But what happens for the next roof 10 years down the road? Will they believe that your home is just as important to them as it is to you? That's the conversation. Now, education and workforce training, same thing. It's the jobs that we create within this community, within this industry. Do they also engage in and believe what we believe about how important this resource is? And the outdoor industry anchors, that's just another way to say what is important to us should be important to whoever moves here, recreates here, and is a part of the process that we're trying to grow. So at this point, taking it at 30,000, I'd like to turn it over to, you're gonna come up and introduce the next speaker? Yes. And hopefully take it down to about 20,000 feet? Higher, 30, 40, 50? Great, perfect. Everybody, thanks for listening. I look forward to the questions.
Great. Thank you. Well, thank you all, and welcome my guests, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me down. Always fun for me to come back to Boulder. Did a couple of my degrees here in between environmental design. Started off, so a little bit of an affinity for the studio students here, and then finished up studying landscape ecology, and so thinking about some of these kinds of aspects. And in between there, I actually made snowboards and snowboarded in Berthoud Pass, only place that allowed it. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about open space and thinking big, long-term, and boldly, and think about a couple aspects, a little bit more about obviously conservation biology and geography, and how to maintain and protect the values and the things that we seek in our outdoors and in recreating. So these are the couple things I'd like to think about. Actually, it's hard to see up there. I'll read it to you. It says, "Welcome to Boulder. free information, etc. But the little sign says, stay a while, play a while, you'll like Boulder. So I kind of like that. It's a nice 1950s sign. So I thought, similar to what Luis, echoing some of his points, I think we need to learn from the past to plan for the future, so I'll touch on that. We need to balance goals and values. And so I think that just like the National Park Service, who has a mandate of protecting the resources and providing access to that, we need to balance that. I think that's the crux of the challenge here, is being careful about that balance. We need to think about landscapes and long view planning, and similarly to the earlier comments, seizing change as an opportunity. So let me proceed a little bit. So I'm going to have boots on the ground, if you will, some pictures, and also from the space shuttle, if you will. At any rate, let me start this way. Thinking about some events from 50 years ago. So this is a stunning picture in my mind. I just found this on the web, this amazing device. But 1952, about 50 years ago, Boulder-Denver Turnpike completed and starts the population boom. This is what it looked like when it opened, okay, 1952. Another thing that happened, 1958, Charles Keeling begins measuring CO2, carbon dioxide, in Hawaii. 1959, Plan Boulder secured passage of the Blue Line, which essentially restricted growth above a certain elevation, protecting the backdrop and the beauty of Boulder, right? And there was an exception made in 1961 for NCAR, interestingly enough. 1964, well, somewhere between those years, I'll let you guess, I was born. 1962, Wilderness Act was passed. Interestingly enough, bicycles were banned in 1986. 1965, the IBM plant was built along Longmont Diagonal. Right? All these things were events and challenges to the community at the time and to the planning at the time. So we face similar issues, so let's learn from that. 1967, this is my favorite one. Boulder's voters approved nation's first tax to preserve open space. And they were so happy, they also approved the sale of intoxicating beverages after a 60-year ban. All right, 1967, a little bit of science thrown in here. MacArthur and E.O. Wilson, very famous biologist, published a book, that's sort of the Bible for my work, Theory of Island Biogeography. 1976, Boulder voters approved the Danish plan to restrict growth to 2%, such a low number, 2%. Okay? Someone in this community has famously given a talk on this, probably over 1,000 times, right? 2% is a doubling of population or housing units or whatever in 35 years. Okay, so learning from our past. I'm so excited to show this one. So this is a letter, actually. So Governor John Love, so some more action from governors, back in the late 1960s said, okay, rapid urbanization of Colorado's Front Range has been taking place, and it's the biggest problem that we should be thinking about. Okay? Nearly 50 years ago, right? This isn't a new problem. We've been thinking about it. We've been using some tools. What I've found fascinating is that he commissioned a group, and they put together, so the design studio folks, pay attention to this. This is amazing to me. This is a map that they developed. So here we are, deep red blobs are roughly the pattern of where the urban areas were, and then sort of the concentric circles are moving out to, about 2,000 or so. So this is their view, one view of what it might look like, okay, unplanned growth, if you will. And then what if we did some other things? What if we tried to preserve some open space, if we planned some buffers, and I don't know all the details of the different scenarios, but the point is they were thinking about it and thinking about what policies might influence the pattern of development and how that might protect or preserve some of their some of the values in the landscape that they want. So anyway, that's fascinating to me. I always think, oh gosh, I just made this new map and it's so cool, it's so brand new, and then I'm like, oh, somebody did that 50 years ago. Okay, so this is a map that I made, and it is cool. So what this is showing in basically Front Range, the big circle there, that blob is Boulder. And so what we're showing is basically 1970 through 2030. So you heard some of the stats from about population growth. This is what it looks like on the landscape, very roughly, very crudely. So you can see the growth of Boulder. You can see the merging of cities and towns together along the Front Range. And so, in a sense, we could, if I could had a lot more time, we could sort of lay this on top of the other maps. How did those folks do back in 1969 when they planned this out? We, in a sense, could be asking that same question. And I actually get to ask that question a lot as a scientist. Well, how good are your models? And my models are perfect when I have this crystal ball and I'm looking into the future. Of course, it's very, very difficult. So another question we have to ask, so we have this pattern of growth, lots of population, where is it going? Where are we protecting land? So this is another animation. It's a little bit harder to see. It's a little bit slower, but you can start to see open space starting to be essentially populated, if you will. But we have to ask this question, are the trends in open space keeping up with our trends in development, right? So we have these two trajectories, and so I'm sort of asking, well, how do these collide? Do they collide? Is that a bad thing? How can we leverage? How can we flip this question around perhaps a little bit? So when I look at that problem, that sort of collision course or that balance, how do we balance these kinds of things? The scientist comes out at me and people say, well, how do we think about this differently? So what's the integrity of the landscape? And so we have our own definitions, and we don't have to get into all the details in here, but it's essentially thinking about the ability of an ecological system to support and maintain organisms, so plants, animals, and the functioning of that. So that's ecological process, that's wildfires, that's floods, it's all kinds of those aspects that keep a wild system wild and dynamic, really. So these are some of the terms, not important about all the details there, but what I suggest is that having these things are super important. So the analogy that I like to use is if we want to know how well the stock market did, we go to some index, a Dow Jones perhaps, something like that. Interesting fact, Jones was actually a statistician. He wasn't a broker or anything like that. He sort of helped polish up what the heck that Dow Jones metric looked like. We need to have a way that we can evaluate what kind of effects we're having on the landscape so that we know if we apply this plan or this treatment, is it getting better or is it getting worse? What's some quantitative way of doing that? So we've been working on this thing. You may have heard footprint indices. There are a variety of these. This one is something I call the degree of human modification. You can see why I'm not in sales or marketing, but that's what it is. And so importantly, what we're trying to do is differentiate these things. We're differentiating, an urban area, and we're thinking about the impact, which is roughly a measure of the intensity, or how much energy did it take to convert that and to maintain that. So the important point really is we want to be able to distinguish, maybe an urban area from an agricultural cropland area. Yeah, maybe that's a little bit more natural, quote unquote, from an area that might be an open space or something like that. We want to be able to quantify all of those things. And somewhere in there, this gray area of sort of recreational use on open space exists, I would submit. We're getting better at understanding where that is, but it's a difficult challenge. This is a map that I just created last week, so I'm super excited to actually get this done. We actually showed it to some folks this morning. But what it is it's the highest resolution. It's about 30 meters. It's basically about a football field or so is the resolution of these data. And so we can basically examine the human modification in very quantifiable terms. I would submit that no other agency, no federal agency, no state agency, folks don't have this. We don't measure this stuff very well. Public agencies measure public lands. The Forest Service measures the Forest Service. The Park Service measures the Park Service lands. We don't, private lands, they're different. There's no one integrated comprehensive framework, and that's what we're trying to do here. And there are some important reasons for that, so that we can understand the impacts on wildlife habitat and potential improvements as well. Another important aspect is that we can start to tease out what kinds of stressors are applying to the landscape. This one is basically pulling one element of that broader impact, and that is urban. So this is sort of the typical things we think about. Where are housing units, residential, commercial, industrial, et cetera. So this is what the pattern looks like, Boulder, roughly right about here. We can pull apart oil and gas. So this is energy. Okay, so it's not only oil and gas in the big blob here in year 2001. We can also, at the very top there, the top purple blob, any guess what that is? What are some of the new forms of energy we have around here? Wind, yeah. Fort Collins and New Belgium, we're all about that, right? So there are wind farms here, wind farms down here. So we're innovating. There's solar. We actually have solar stuff. I don't see any of them here, but we're trying to understand this in a comprehensive way. This is the transportation infrastructure, how I got down here, how we got down here tonight. Understanding the power line infrastructure. All of these things add up, and they're important. They're important in managing wildfires, all of these kinds of things. This is agriculture, including agricultural croplands, but also, importantly, where livestock are, okay? And so we can begin to understand where these sources of effluents and other things. All right. One of the things that you didn't see that I made a map of yet, because it's reasonably hard. I think that we're making some advances, but are some of the ecological effects of recreation. Okay, so I think that there's an emerging literature that talks about the effects of recreation and trying to grapple with the idea of how much is too much and what's the carrying capacity. Worked on a variety of these projects, particularly in national parks, for example. So there's emerging literature on this. I know that your group down here has been some of the leaders in thinking about that. Just a real quick sort of on the ground, this is some work that Jesse Lewis, a colleague of mine at Conservation Science Partners and a CSU student did. So basically, they were looking at the interaction of they were looking at populations of puma and bobcats in a highly recreated area, in an area that has a little bit less use. And so on the graph on the right, I don't want to make too many graphs and figures, but basically the idea is that they're definitely quantifiable. There are effects in daytime, nighttime usage, in home range usage, in overall activity, those kinds of things. So we're beginning to be able to understand what these dynamics are. Okay, so as a scientist, I see my role is I need to provide that information in the best way that I can for you all, for society to debate. We're trying to raise the level of the discussion. Just another quick sort of anecdote. This is kind of interesting. So in the top one, obviously a puma walking down a trail at roughly about 7 p.m. About 7 minutes later, some folks coming up the other way. This points out to me that it's something that's very hard to see and quantify. So we think, oh, well, nothing's out here. We're not doing anything. There are some really important effects that we're beginning to quantify, in particular with this remote camera triggered kind of technology. So there's some really interesting stuff there. Okay, so after some data there, a little bit of levity. So what are we going to get? We're going to get wildlife preserves that are really sterile, and we can go and look at them and gawk at them, and that's kind of cool. So what do we need to do? A really wild idea. I love the sort of balance between craziness and craziness and genius. And I always attribute that statement to Repo Man, if you remember that one. But I don't think that they were the first people to say it. This is something that E.O. Wilson, remember back to 1967, the theory of island biogeography, he basically thinks this wild idea. We need to have half the planet for wildlife. We need to have that set aside. And that's how we're going to be able to persist. And of course, there are other organizations, notably WILD here in Boulder, who's been talking about this for a while as well. So crazy idea. I'll go even further. We need to get crazier than that. And one of the challenges is we talk about just sort of acres. We want to protect X number of acres. Well, it's not enough. It's just like maybe perhaps, I don't know if this analogy works perfectly, but your stock portfolio. You don't want to put all your money in one place. You want to have it spread out. You want to have it represented and balanced. And so this is another sort of graph-heavy, number-heavy kind of thing. Basically, these lines are, this is what we call ecological systems. So you can think of riparian areas or forests or grasslands, something like that. And the idea is that we want to protect a bit of each of those rather than what we have right now, which is typically what we call rock and ice. We protect rock and ice as a legacy of some of our, well, we can talk about that more. So the basic point is that in the Southern Rockies, sort of the mountainous part of Boulder County, we're doing reasonably well in protection levels. In the plains areas, we're not doing as well. And so we need to ask that question. It's not just about total acres, it's about how well they're represented or not. And so I'm sort of getting into details here, but they are important. Oh, there's this other thing. Keeling is famous for collecting those data, which are probably some of the most widely read, scientific data of today, thinking about what has been the trajectory of carbon dioxide. So climate change adaptation. So a lot of my work now is thinking about climate change and what are the strategies that we can use and suggest to try to maintain the functioning of ecosystems, biodiversity, and the ecosystem services that we all use. Clean air, clean water, those kinds of things. So general strategies that are emerging right now, the top one that's out there, ensure connectivity. Allow species to move about the landscape. Really simple, it's hard to do though. Protect refugia, protect key ecosystem features. This is sort of back to this idea of representation. It can't just be protect all forest land or all grassland, but it needs to be mixtures of all these things. And on you can see this. There's a little bit of a plug. So this is a book that is coming out, I think in May, Island Press. I'm one of the co-editors on there. Basically what we did in working with a number of folks, including some great folks in Rocky Mountain National Park, trying to how do we bring climate science information and make it useful, impactful on the ground. So that's largely what that book is about. Okay, so final thoughts. Obviously I'm here to sort of raise, hey, there are social values to protecting the ecological systems for a lot of reasons. And to do that, we need to think about the ecological context, and we need to think about long-term aspects. Climate change is really pushing us ever stronger into that. So connectivity and maintaining those ecological processes are sort of the obvious ones to me. What I think is really neat is that, especially in this community, we have this legacy of bold decisions. That list that I read before, Boulder's been a leader in thinking here. Why not continue that? Why not capitalize on that? Why not seize those as opportunities as well? And I'll leave you to this last question. So I'll stop there, and thank you for your attention.